going to talk about TAN today. And what I want to do with TAN that I think is going to be, I don't know, make it maybe a little easier, it's a short essay. And so I think we can maybe go through it paragraph by paragraph as though we were doing a pre-read on it. Take all those ideas and figure out what's the main idea and what's the supporting detail. So first off, let's make sure we all understand a general idea of what TAN's argument is. What's she saying?
Don't judge a book by a cover.
Okay, so that's our implied point, but still pretty much her main point. I mean, I think it would be impossible. Okay, remember this with a summary. What you're trying to say is this true? So could somebody look at this and say it's not at all about judging a book by its cover? I can't find anything in there that says that. I don't think so. I think it's definitely there. So that's what you're going to put at the very end. So the very last sentence of your summary is going to say, overall, her point seems to be it's not right to judge a book by its cover. And that's her main point. What else? What else is she discussing in here? What kinds of situations does her mother find herself in with regard to language? Can you name one? Just give me an example of something that happened with her mother related to language. Somebody misunderstanding her mom or thinking something about her mom that they shouldn't. Take a look at page 77, halfway down the page. My mother has long realized the limitations of her English as well. When I was 15, she used to have me call people on the phone to pretend I was she. In this guise, I was forced to ask for information or even to complain and yell at people who had been rude to her. One time it was a call to her stockbroker in New York. She had cashed out her small portfolio, and it just so happened we were going to go to New York the next week, our very first trip outside California. I had to get on the phone to say in an adolescent voice that was not very convincing, "This is Mrs. Tan." So in this case, it's a stockbroker who she can't talk to. She can't communicate with the guy because of her problems with English. So that's one example. And there's another one that's really prominent in here, where she's misunderstood. It's on the next page. What's going on in the hospital? They've lost her CAT scan, and she's having a hard time convincing them to take it seriously because they're not taking her seriously because of her poor English skills. So those two examples are the two strongest examples that are given, and they're kind of, in terms of how this shows you the argument, those are the two most important ones. So keep those in mind. But let's go through it just kind of paragraph by paragraph. And if an author is doing a real careful job of writing, very often what you'll find is the argument progresses paragraph by paragraph, and you'll understand exactly the order that things are going in. So she says, I'm not a scholar of English or literature. I cannot give much more than a personal opinion on the English language and its variations in this country or others. So she's just stating what her credentials are. And then she says, I'm a writer. By that definition, I'm someone who always loved language. I'm fascinated by language in daily life. Does any of this belong in the summary? Why?
Because it's describing who she is.
Mm-hmm. But if you think about this, what you've got, this is this kind of thing we're talking about with ethos. Who I am is important. Who I am makes a difference. But is also what I'm saying. Every author, to some extent, needs to provide an ethos or credentials or something like that that says, this is why I make this argument, this is why you should listen to me. But when we're doing a summary, we don't really have to look at that. We don't really have to explain why the author should be listened to or not be listened to. All we have to do is figure out what their argument is. So this is kind of a preamble to what she's doing in her actual argument, but I would say that's not necessary to explain who she is. So we start, again, with typically you're going to say, in the essay, Mother Tongue, Amy Tan describes or discusses, and then we're going to figure out what the things are. So let's get rid of who she is and just talk about what she is saying. All right, she says, recently I was made keenly aware of the different Englishes I do use. I was giving a talk to a large group of people, the same talk I had already given to half a dozen other groups. The nature of the talk was about my writing, my life, and my book, The Joy of Luck Club. The talk was going along well enough until I remembered one major difference that made the whole talk seem wrong. My mother was in the room, and it was perhaps the first time she had heard me give a lengthy speech using the kind of English that I have never used with her. Are we getting into the argument here? She's running up to it. What's the most important idea that comes out of that?
That her mother is hearing her talk in a way she's never talked before for the first time.
Okay. So she's saying, I can differentiate between my language and my mother's language. So, and they're two different things. What's the most compact, easy way you could summarize this idea using the same kind of words that Tan is using? How does she refer to this? We'll talk in this class about what we call proprietary expressions, proprietary words, and that means a word that one author uses in a certain way that nobody else has used before. And so you look at it and you have to put it in quotation marks because you're going to say, if I use that word around anybody else, you'd say, I don't know what you're talking about. But if I say, you understand this word in the way that Amy Tan understands this word, it means something different. What's the word that she uses in a way that you've never seen before in this first section? There's one in here that would probably get a red underline from Microsoft Word. Was it?
I don't know. Or, yeah, how do you say it? K-E-E-N-L-Y.
Keenly? No, not keenly. Yeah? Englishes. I've never tried this, but I'm pretty sure that if you put Englishes in your paper, Microsoft Word would say, that's not a word, that doesn't work. This is a proprietary word. Amy Tan has basically made up this word to describe something. And so this is a core concept. If you put it in quotation marks, this gives you a little bit of freedom. If I wrote in this essay, Tan, and real quick, just so you know this, when you first bring up an author, always use their first and last name. There's a little bit of, I don't know, some people don't believe this anymore, but there's a little bit of, I think, sexism stuck in the English language in that if I don't tell people this and I teach these two essays, everybody writes their position paper on Sedaris and they say, in this essay, David Sedaris writes this. And they write about Tan and they say, in this essay, Amy writes about something else. You know, they'll refer to her just as Amy. And I don't know why that is. I think it's kind of a subconscious thing, but a lot of times when people are referring to women, they'll just use the first name. Always refer to her as Amy Tan the first time, and then from that point on, every time you refer to her as Tan, just by her last name. Okay, and it's a rule that goes on to the point of almost being silly at times. So for example, we're going to read some lyrics by Tupac Shakur. What are you going to call him in an essay? Shakur. And people are going to say, you mean Tupac? No, Shakur, because it's an English essay. You break the rules of how he's normally referred to because the rules of English grammar, the rules of college writing say that you always use the last name. So, in this essay, Tan Tan describes the Englishes she uses. If I write that, you're going to look at it and you're going to say, that's not a word. You don't get to do that. But Tan does because she's an established author. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, I'm going to highlight that word. I'm going to pull it out and say, it's deserving of special attention. There's something special about that word, and I'm probably going to explain it to you later on. But what it's saying is, know that I understand that this isn't a word too. That's why I'm putting it in quotation marks. You ever see somebody do that when somebody says something wrong, and they're trying to make fun of them, and so they, trying to think of an example of this. Okay. Okay, he said he went to the library instead of library. If I put the quotation marks in there, what I'm saying is, I know it's library. I'm just saying that he said library. Okay. So the first thing we've got that's important is she's talking about Englishes. She's talking about multiple languages that her mother, that she speaks, that count as English, and yet they have different sets of rules. So that's an important concept coming out of here. All right. She says, I was saying things like the intersection of memory upon imagination, and there is an aspect of my fiction that relates to thus and thus. A speech filled with carefully wrought grammatical phrases burdened, it suddenly seemed to me, with nominalized forms, past perfect tenses, conditional phrases. In other words, what she's saying is, I'm using academic English. I'm using a kind of English that when I write academic papers, that's the way it goes, but my mom's not going to understand it. All right, and then she starts the next one. Just last week, I was walking down the street with my mother, and I again found myself conscious of the English I was using, the English I do use with her. We were talking about the price of new and used furniture, and I heard myself saying this, not waste money that way. My husband was with us as well, and he didn't notice any switch in my English, and then I realized why. It's because over the 20 years we've been together, I've often used that same kind of English with him. So, does this explain Englishes? Does this give you enough information that you could put a line after this that lets your reader know that I know what she means by Englishes, I'm going to explain it to you? Yeah. So, I'm probably going to write something like, let's say, okay, in Tan's essay, sorry, I left the word out. In Tan's essay, the English that she refers to, what are they?
Different ways of speaking language.
Are they different languages?
I mean, not different language, but a different form of speaking it.
Yeah.
Different
So,
accents. Yeah.
not even necessarily accent, and not quite a dialect, because a dialect is a little bigger than that. But what you would say is, the Englishes she refers to are different ways that she speaks English depending on who she's talking to, especially when she's talking to her mother, whose background is not as a native English speaker. So the idea here is, the origins of these Englishes come from another language. The fact that her mother grew up speaking some other dialect other than English, some other language other than English, changes her dialect. Any of you have any experience with this? Not necessarily with Chinese dialects, but with other languages? Yeah?
Yeah, this summer there was a guy that came up when I was working. He didn't speak a lot of English,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can communicate and people will understand you, but it's not proper English. And some people have weird responses to it. I'm gonna get back to Sedaris, because Sedaris is dealing with some real stereotypes of French people, especially people in Paris, that they're really snobby and they don't like you speaking their language in a way that isn't quite proper. I've been in Paris, and I've taken 3 years of French lessons, and I wanted to get breakfast one day, and I walked down to this little place where a guy was selling pastries, and my accent is pretty good, but probably what I said to him translated would be roughly, me, that pastry like would, yes. And perfectly understandable, and he looks at me and he says, no, no, no. You speak no me language is ugly, bad. You break language. Me talk English, you. And then he says, point. So he's just saying, all I want you to do is do caveman style. Just say, that one. But he was offended by the fact that my French was not proper French, that it had mistakes in it. And it kind of bears out that kind of stereotype that we have about French people. But, you know, some people are very picky about their language. So what she's saying here is the origins of it come from another language. What's another example you can think of something that's not quite English? Something that's influenced by another language? Any of you ever use Spanglish? Yeah? What does Spanglish mean?
Pretty much when you use English and Spanish words together. So, like I use it when I speak to my mother. Like if there's a certain word that I don't know in Spanish, then I use the English word for it.
Yeah. It's always, I'll be switching around stations. I'll come to a Spanish-speaking station, and the guy's talking is like, what I hear is blah, 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 Walmart, blah, 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 blah. You know, and I'm like, Walmart, okay. But then you also get words thrown in that are out of the English language, and, you know, so Spanglish, what Spanglish basically means is you're somewhere in between the two languages, and when one fails, you're going to pick up on the other one. And we'll read about that later on, because this is what Gloria Anzaldúa writes about in her essay. She writes about the idea that Spanglish is seen as being something that should be disapproved of. Tan is writing about the same thing. She's saying the origins come from another language. So that's where the English has come from. All right, so she says, so you'll have some idea of what this family talk I heard sounds like. I'll quote what my mother said during a recent conversation, which I videotaped and then transcribed. Do you need to put this in here? No. And Tan is nice enough to tell you exactly why. What she says here is, so that you'll have some idea of what this family talk I heard sounds like. So what she's saying in here is, this is a subordinate example. The idea is, my mother speaks a language that is different from yours. I'm going to give you an example. If it's an example, you don't include it in a summary because it's not part of it. But it's really funny the way she says it. Du Zhuang, having business like fruit stand, like off the street kind. You know, I've heard people speak like this. I think it's really, you know, it's interesting because I can almost hear what she's saying there. But we get down to the end there. I gone to boys' side. They have YMCA dinner. Chinese age, I was 19. At that point, you're saying, okay, I can skip that entire paragraph. It's an example. It works well as an example, but I don't need to include it in the summary. All right. You should know. Now, is this going to be an example or is this going to be a point? A point. If she says you should know this, she's saying it's important, it's part of my main point. You should know that my mother's expressive command of English belies how much she actually understands. And that's kind of hard to understand. This is using, I mean, you know what the word belies means? No. It means basically hides or makes false or, you know, somehow it makes us not able to see it. So what she's saying is the way she speaks English convinces us, or no, how would you put it? The way she speaks English can convince you of something that's not true. It's not going to let you know how well she actually does know English. She says she reads the Forbes report, listens to Wall Street Week, converses daily with her stockbroker, reads all of Shirley MacLaine's books with ease, all kinds of things I can't begin to understand. Summarize that. What's she saying there? Okay, now I'm trying to think of a way to describe this without sounding like I'm judging it. I want to say something like that her mother's flawed use of English is because, it is not because of how she thinks, but I don't want to use the word flawed because that's kind of going against what Tana's saying.
It's different.
Different. What's another word you could think of? Because different, you have to say what it's different from.
Unique.
I like unique. I think, and unique, technically it's not right. That word used to mean there's only one thing like it anywhere. And it's kind of changed. So I think unique you can use, if you're going to get nitpicky, it's not quite unique because there are other people who use that dialect, but we'll use it. So her unique use of English is not because of how she thinks, but rather is not because she's not intelligent. Rather, her unique use of English comes from the language that she grew up speaking. All right, now we get into things like, some of my friends tell me that they understand 50% of what my mother says. Some say they understand 80 to 90%. Is that necessary detail?
Kinda, 'cause it explains how some people do understand her.
Mm-hmm. I'm kind of torn on that one. You probably could, and it's not like there's only one summary that goes with this. It's not like you're trying to find the secret summary that's the only word you could put down here. Some people are going to find some things interesting, other things are going to find other things interesting. And to some extent, it depends on what you're doing in your analysis, because your analysis has to pick up on the things you included in your summary. You can just tack it on. So, that her mother's use of English is not because of a lack of intelligence, and that many of her friends can understand 50 to 90% of what her mother is saying. That, you're not saying it's necessarily the most important point. It could be an add-on point, or it could be a main point. It's up to your reader to decide. All right, her language as I hear it is vivid, direct, full of observation and imagery. That was the language that helped shape the way I saw things, expressed things, made sense of the world. Again, I'd say that's a supporting detail. She's talking about how she interacted with it. All right, watch for this, and this is something you should notice in your pre-reads. When you're just kind of skimming through it and looking at what it looks like. You see how there's that double space on page 77? Sometimes that's the key to understanding the entire essay. I've seen essays where, I tell you guys to write in a certain way. I tell you guys to write where you've got, we'll talk about this later on in class, but the basic 3 parts of an essay is, this is the way things seem right now, and the second step is to say, this is why there's something wrong with seeing things in that way, and the third step is to say, this is a better way to look at it. That's almost always how arguments run. I've seen so many academic arguments that are divided into 3 parts with those double spaces in there, where you'll have something that describes how things are, which she's just done, right? She's saying, this is how people see my mother, and it's not right. Now, she's got this double space there, and she's going to go to a new part of her argument. She's going to change gears. So, this has got to be important. Just from the way it's set up here, you know that it has to be important. So she says, lately I've been giving more thought to the kind of English my mother speaks. Like others, I have described it to people as broken or fractured English, but I wince when I say that. It's always bothered me that I can think of no other way to describe it other than broken, as if it were damaged and needed to be fixed, as if it lacked a certain wholeness and soundness. I've heard other terms used, limited English, for example, but they seem just as bad, as if everything is limited, including people's perception of that limited English speaker. What's the point here?
People look at her language as if it's broken, like it's not right.
What people?
Society.
Society, yes, and that's what she was describing in the previous one, right? In the previous section, before that double space, what she's saying is, people look at what my mother says, and they may not understand how intelligent she is because they think that her language is broken. Okay, here we're going to use something that I'll get into again later on in the class, one of those grammatical principles that it's important to know, and it's called a correlative conjunction. And a correlative conjunction is a special type of coordinator or subordinator. And the way it works is it relates two things to each other through the use of a complex kind of setup. And almost always the way they work is by using something like and this is a good phrase to remember, especially if you're writing a position paper and you're trying to expand somebody's argument and say it applies in other circumstances beside what they're describing in their essay. So if you wanted to say, Sedaris is writing about learning a language, but this also applies in other places as well, I could put together a sentence that says something like, Sedaris claims that, okay, if I'm making my point about it, I'm going to say, Sedaris' argument applies not only when learning languages, but also when learning other complex rule-based systems like mathematics or chemistry. So not only French, but also chemistry and math. That's a correlative conjunction. So if I use this, then I'm going to say, so she says, this judgment of my mother based on her language applies not only to people who don't know my mother, so you say for Tan, it's not only people who don't know her mother, but also, who else is Tan talking about?
People that do.
Even more than that. What's that?
Herself.
Herself. She's saying that because I don't have a vocabulary to describe what my mother is doing, I tend to look at it and I tend to look down on her because of it, even though I'm not trying to. And that's why she sets that paragraph apart. What she's saying in that paragraph is, you know what, I can understand with strangers, but what's weird about it is it also affects how I look at my own mother. So if that's the right idea, you'll see it expanded in examples. What does she say next? She says, I know this for a fact because when I was growing up, my mother's limited English limited my perception of her. I was ashamed of her English. I believed that her English reflected the quality of what she had to say. So that's a supporting detail, but it's backing up the idea that Tan is saying she judged her mother as well. Okay, and then she says, my mother has long realized the limitations of her English. Okay, she's long realized the limitations of her English as well. When I was 15, she used to have me call people on the phone to pretend I was she. We've already talked about this one. Does this belong in the summary, or is it a supporting detail? It depends. If you're just trying to capture the idea of her mother and her mother's Englishes, it's a supporting detail. But if it's something that you're going to make use of in your analysis, and a lot of people do, and I'll tell you how. Some people look at this and they say, okay, you're talking about how difficult it is for your mother because her English isn't perfect, but you're also pointing out that one of the ways she compensates is by using you as a translator. And some people would say that's how it should be. If a person's English isn't perfect, it's their responsibility to find a translator. It's their responsibility to find a family member. If you ever have that in your family, you've got parents or grandparents whose English isn't very good, so they'll drag along one of the kids when they go places because the kid's going to translate. And it's just something that you do because you say, hey, my English isn't good enough to do this. I did this all the time when I lived in Ukraine. I didn't speak the language, so I was like, I got to go do something, so my wife has to come along with me. Or I had translators who worked with me when I was working at the embassy who would translate things for me. And I just saw that as my responsibility because I wasn't going to walk up to people and say, this is Ukraine, so speak English. You know, it doesn't make any sense at all. So if you're going to use this later on as part of your analysis, if your analysis is, pardon me, not your analysis, your integration. If your integration is going to say, to some extent, it's a person's job to provide their own translator, to make up for this problem. In other words, they're the one with the language problem and they need to fix it, then you're going to want to include that detail. If you're siding with tan and you're probably backing tan up, you might not want to include that detail. It depends on how you're setting up your summary. But like I said, summaries can be directed toward a specific reading. There's no such thing, I think, as a perfectly objective summary. You try to be as objective as you can, but you include the details that you're going to use later on. All right. Now, when she gives this example, she says, my mother was standing at the bank whispering loudly, why he don't send me check already 2 weeks late, so mad he lied to me, losing me money. And then I said in perfect English, yes, I'm getting rather concerned. You had agreed to send the check 2 weeks ago, but it hasn't arrived. So both these things mean the same thing? Pretty much. Pretty much mean exactly the same thing. So why did she have her daughter do it instead of her?
Sounds more intelligent.
Sounds more intelligent. It sounds like somebody you're going to have to take seriously. Yeah. Okay, and then she began to talk more loudly, and she's continuing to describe this example. Do you want to put this example in, or do you want to count it as a supporting detail?
Put it in.
I would agree. I would agree it's an important detail. But I'm going to show you a way to do this that it kind of compacts a lot of things. So you can say a lot of things in one sentence instead of having to add several sentences. So we know that this example's in here. I'm going to put this in here. But then we go on. She said, we used a similar routine just 5 days ago for a situation that was far less humorous. What does that mean? Far less humorous? What's she saying about this example? The first one is entertaining, right? Kind of trivial. Didn't really make that much difference. You can kind of laugh at it. But the second one, what about it?
It's serious.
It's deadly serious, yeah. And she goes on to say, she's having a CAT scan. She's got a tumor, and they've lost her stuff. And they're behaving like they don't have to do anything about it because she doesn't speak good English. Now, if I want to put both of those examples in one sentence, what am I going to do?
Medical problems, I guess.
So one's medical problems, the other is financial problems. So I could say ranging from financial problems to medical problems, but is that what she's getting at by including both of these examples? She's saying sometimes it's funny and the other times it's deadly serious. That's the contrast she's setting up there. So you probably want to say, okay, she describes several interactions ranging from humorous ones to deadly serious ones to show that at times this is a very, very serious problem for her mother. Okay, and then we go on. I think my mother's English almost had an effect on limiting my possibilities in life as well. Sociologists and linguists probably will tell you that a person's developing language skills are more influenced by peers, but I do think the language spoken by the family, especially in immigrant families, which are more insular, plays a large role in shaping the language of the child. Why is she saying that?
What paragraph is that in?
That's on page 78. It's the full paragraph in the middle of the page. So I think my mother's English almost had an effect on limiting my possibilities as well.
That because of her mom, she suffered in school, or
Mm-hmm. Now this is so important. This is such an important part in this essay. Because the idea here is she then explains that her own language may have been limited by the fact that her mother's English was not perfect, and that other people may have similar experiences when growing up in houses where English is not the native language of the parents. Why is that such an important point?
Because a lot of people grow up in houses where the parents don't speak English.
Mm-hmm. So what she's saying is, it's not just me. It affected me, but there are many people who you need to know about who are affected in exactly the same way by their situation. This is the point where she starts to use that composition logical fallacy, where she's saying, it's not just me. I experienced this, but I think you got to know about it because there are many people like me who've gone through this as well. This is where it becomes not a personal reminiscence, but a complex argument where she's saying, this happens to people and you need to know about it. So, one of the key points in the argument right here is when she's saying, she explains that it's not just her, but that many other people have been through similar circumstances. And she goes into a long example. This one's hard for me because I like to follow every point that an author is making, but in this case, Tan goes off to talk about word analogies and other things like that and how she writes, and I don't see it as being really crucial to the point she's making in the essay. It's almost like she's going off on an aside here. So I don't want to say it's not important because the author wrote it, but it seems to be not part of the main argument. So if I'm saying the main argument is about Tan and her mother and their relationship and how her mother's English affected her and how other people might find themselves in the same situation, I can possibly even end it there, maybe acknowledging what goes on next. I might say something like, she goes on to discuss how this may have altered her horizons as a student and changed the way she looked at herself. But I don't want to put too much of this in here because it's almost like a distraction. You know, it's almost like it takes away from the main point. So she says, it was easier for her to do math than other things because math is precise. It's not limited by what words you're using to describe it. It's just there. And then she goes on to explain that this may not just be true for her, but other people who are Asian. We have this stereotype of Asian people being good at math, and she's saying maybe it's not a way their brains work, maybe it's due to their background in language that they gravitate toward English, they gravitate toward math because the rules are more precise. Is that covered by what we just said here? The way my mother spoke changed my horizons, changed the things that I would be able to do in my life. I think you can count it as a supporting detail. Okay, she says the same was true with word analogies, pairs of words in which you're supposed to find some sort of logical semantic relationship. Again, supporting detail. And notice, this is where we get into this idea of supporting details being coordinate and not subordinate. If a paragraph begins, the same was true with word analogies, that's an added on example. That's coordinate, and you don't need to put it in your summary. All you're saying, she's saying, here's another thing that'll point out the same thing. But if it's pointing out the same thing, you don't need to include it. All right, now we've got another big double space. So now we're at the third point, and this may be where she's making her main argument. And notice that this does work very much like an enthymeme. She started off by saying, my mom speaks in a certain way and it's kind of interesting and different. Second section says, my mom runs into a lot of problems because of this, and other people run into the same kinds of problems. So it's not something just to laugh at, it's something very serious that we need to look at. The third step should be some kind of a warrant, some kind of a statement about what we need to do at this point. So she says, I've been thinking about this lately, about my mother's English, about achievement tests, because I've been asked as a writer why there are not more Asian Americans represented in American literature, why there are few Asian Americans enrolled in creative writing programs, and this goes back to the point she just made, which is to say that Asian people tend to gravitate toward things that are more precise. And she says, fortunately, I happen to be rebellious in nature and enjoy the challenge of disproving assumptions made about me. So she says, I'm not average. I do new things. Talks about writing fiction. And then she says, for reasons I won't go into today, I decided that I should envision a reader for stories that I would write. And she's talking about envisioning her mother as the subject who she's writing to. Again, I think these are more supporting details. So I think we've got almost everything we need here. So we've got the idea that she says her mother's English is different, it's unique, there are reasons for it to be unique, it causes her a great deal of trouble in life. And I don't think she makes her final point clearly, but what's she trying to imply? What does she want you to do as a result of reading this? And this, we already said this, right? The implied point, but the strongest point that she seems to be making is it's not right for people to judge her mother by the way she speaks. The point here is we should not judge a book by its cover. We should try to look more deeply into who these people are and why they speak the way they do. And it's a good moral. You know, you look at it, it's like, okay, that's true. That's how I would like to be thought of myself. If people misunderstand me, I don't want them to think I'm stupid. I want them to think maybe they didn't get what I was saying and ask me questions about it. All right. So now we're going to get into the analysis. So, I talked about how the argument works. So if we start out the way we almost always start out an analysis, which is to say, so Tan's essay seems to be based on the assumption that, what is the assumption if you say don't judge a book by its cover?
That everybody judges somebody. Like they think before they know.
Okay, now, I know, I'm looking confused. I'm not confused, it's just you went in a direction that I wouldn't have taken. And that's not wrong. That's just a different way to look at it. So she's generalizing, and what she's saying is the stockbroker did it, the people in the hospital did it, other people do it as well, and the generalization is you probably do it too. And that's true. So, say it again. How did you say it?
Wait, the first one and the second one that I said. Like, they judge before they know, I guess.
Okay, so the assumption is okay, so the assumption that most or even all people are as judgmental as the stockbroker or as the people in the hospital. Do you think that works? Do you think that's an assumption that's in there? Yeah? Could you disagree with it? That's the thing about assumptions, is if it's an assumption, you have the potential to disagree with it. You can't disagree with a summary. If I say she writes about this, you can't say, no, she doesn't. She does, it's fact. When you get into the analysis, it's things that are implied. So if you're saying she seems to be implying that all people are equally judgmental, and I can look at that and I can say, you know, she is, and I'm really a little bit bothered by that, because if she's saying you have the potential to be just as prejudiced as these other people, that offends me. I don't think that captures who I am. So this is a good way to start analyzing it. You can agree with it or disagree with it. So if in the integration you want to say, and she's right, people are exactly this prejudiced, I see it every day in my life, then you're saying she's right. In fact, she's even more right than she seems to be, and we can try new examples to show this. Or you can say, she's right to some extent, but not everybody is this way. And I can look at examples of people who aren't this way. What's another way to describe an assumption that's in here? Sometimes you can take it from your own political perspectives, or just throw these ideas out there as though they were your political perspectives. I think about, like, I don't do this a lot, but sometimes I listen to extreme right-wing radio shows like Rush Limbaugh, because these people will make very, very strong arguments in a very, very blatant way. So Rush Limbaugh, or somebody like that, listen to this, what's he going to say? He's going to say, live in America, speak English. It's not my problem if your mom doesn't speak the right language. You need to fix it. She doesn't. And that's a really harsh way to put it, but really it is an assumption, right? And the assumption is what? Whose responsibility is it to fix her mother's problem? Mm-mm.
It's yourself.
It's the fault of the people who interact with her mom. She's not saying, my mom needs to communicate better with the people in the hospital. She says, the people in the hospital need to be nicer to my mom and pay more attention to her. The stockbroker needs to have more consideration for my mom because he doesn't understand how cool she is underneath the surface. So, I had to put this in real technical terms, translated into your own, but all right. Now, looking at these in terms of logical fallacies, this one is easy. Most or all people are as judgmental as people in these situations. That's a standard common generalization. It's really easy to see and easy to write about. This one says the assumption is the burden of accommodation falls upon the people who interact with people like her mother. In other words, her mother isn't the one who needs to accommodate. It's those people who need to accommodate her mother and be nicer to her mother. Is that a logical fallacy? If it is, which one is it? And I have trouble with this. I don't know how to quite say that it is a logical fallacy. If somebody said that and you disagreed with them, what would you say?
That they should try to accommodate people.
Why?
Just because they're accommodating them, they should try to do the same.
There, okay. Now you just brought up something that isn't stated here, but it's very much a part of this. This does not acknowledge that her mother is already doing a lot of accommodating, that she already knows English, that she's trying very hard, that she's speaking it to the best of her ability. She is trying to come over to the English side of things and already accommodating. So I would say this is what we would call cherry picking or straw man. What it does is it portrays her mother as being lazy. It portrays her mother as not taking enough care to do this the right way. And that's an assumption about her mother, but it's not necessarily true. It's partially true, but there are other ways to look at it. You can think of a third one for the analysis that seems to be based on. This is why I asked yesterday if any of you ever get into this kind of situation in your workplace or in your day-to-day life, where if I was to say to you, hey, you are being intolerant of that person. You need to just do everything you can to try to take care of this person and make sure that they have a happy experience, however you're interacting with them, especially customer service. you're working with somebody whose English isn't perfect, and if I was to say to you, stop being so mean to that person, how are you going to defend yourself?
Maybe you're not being mean, but just the way it comes off, because you don't understand them, so you're trying to understand them. But they
Almost
take it
the
as
s-
being
Yeah.
rude.
Almost the same thing as what this is saying, only the other way around. Almost as you're saying, hey, the stockbroker is trying. The people in the hospital are trying. They are already trying to accommodate a person who's very difficult to deal with because of her English. So expand that a little bit more. If it's you and you're in that situation, how are you going to defend yourself? Think of an example. Can any of you think off the top of your head of an example where you're working with somebody whose English wasn't very good and it frustrated you? Yeah? What happened?
I was trying to order a part for my computer online, and I had to talk to somebody who was from a different country or something, and their English wasn't very great. So I was trying to tell them my billing address, because apparently I got it wrong on
Mhm.
one thing. Decided to call them and try to get the billing address right, and I had to sit there for 15 minutes trying to spell everything out. And it just kept going back and forth between two different words.
Yeah. And in instances like that, we have an expectation that a person who's doing customer service for something we bought in the United States is going to speak English and is going to, do things in the way that we want them done. So the assumption here, I guess, would be when I'm in a situation like that, what ends up happening is I feel impatient. I look at it and I say, this could have been done 10 minutes ago if I was talking to somebody whose English was perfect, and this is really, really messed up. You guys are saving a couple of bucks by hiring somebody in India, but I'm not getting the job done. So, okay, so the idea is people have the luxury of being able to accommodate this kind of thing, that there's enough time in the day for me to treat every single interaction with every single person as some place where I should think very carefully about who that person is and where they come from and why they are annoying and whatever it is. What it's saying is you really don't have an excuse for being bothered by people because they always have a reason for it. If you can do that, I have a whole lot of respect for you, because I think that's a hard thing to do. I think sometimes we get into situations where it's like, I'd love to spend the whole day accommodating you, but I simply can't. A real weird example of this, but I was in an Ethiopian restaurant in Seattle, and I'm trying to pay for my bill, and this guy keeps trying to talk to me. This is like at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and this guy keeps talking to me, and I'm saying, well, I gotta be respectful because it's an Ethiopian restaurant, and this guy's English isn't particularly good, and he's older than me, so I should be respectful. I'm trying to completely accommodate the guy, till at one point I just said, you can't understand him because he's drunk. And I'm like, drunk is not a culture. Drunk is not one of those things where I have to say, I'm going to take extra special care of you because you drank a lot of beer. And in that case, I said, don't need to accommodate. Sometimes we don't accommodate. Can you think of other situations where you wouldn't accommodate a person? Do you understand what I mean by accommodate? Accommodate means to make it more difficult on you so that it's easier for that person. It slightly inconveniences you, but it's worth the inconvenience because it helps that person a great deal. And this is what Tana's asking for. She's asking for people to accommodate her mother. Where else might you not accommodate? Because this is where we get into the integration section. Yeah.
I worked at a mini golf during the summer, and at night some of the younger people get drunk.
Mm-hmm.
It's a public resort or a family resort, so I usually had to kick them out if they were drunk. I'm not going to accommodate you when you're swearing and because you're drunk and whatever.
Yeah.
So I usually like to kick them out.
And that's a situation where it's physical, right? They can't help talking the way they do because they're drunk,
Yeah.
but we judge them and we say, I don't care, it doesn't matter to me that you chose to be drunk. You chose to be that way. I don't have to help you out. Other situations where you might do the same thing, where you say, I could accommodate you, but I choose not to because I understand why you're being the way you're being. Ever been in a situation where, and I'm not accusing anybody in this room or their families of doing this, but I have seen it often, people whose English becomes selective at points where it is advantageous to them to not understand English? You ever see that? Like, I use this example because it always bugs me. People who don't speak enough English to understand that you should have 10 items or less in the quick check aisle, but they understand enough English to be able to shop at Walmart and to interact with the cashier. It's just, it seems suddenly they don't get that. And it's not just language. I've seen older people do that too. They're like, well, I can get away with this because nobody's going to pick on me because I'm 75 years old. I think some people deliberately manipulate this kind of thing. I think some people deliberately set it up so that it's hard for you to accommodate them, but you're going to do it just because it's difficult to take that hard line and say, look, I don't have to do this. Any of you ever been in a situation where you suddenly said to yourself, that's it, I'm not going to accommodate any more of this, and you went off on a person? I used to work in a bike shop, and we were taught you have to be nice to everybody and accommodate them. So a guy came in one day, and he said, I want to try your exercise machines. And I said, oh, okay, that's fine. And he asked where the bathroom was. I pointed toward the bathroom. He came out in full gym clothes, got on one of the exercise machines, and rode it for 45 minutes. And then he finished up, and he said, you know, I've still got to make my mind up. I might come back tomorrow. I said, okay. He came back the next day, and he says, I still got some deciding to do. Can I try him again? And he did it again. Changed into exercise clothes, got out, worked out for 45 minutes, and said, yeah, I'm still trying to make up my mind. Third day, he wanted to do it again. Did I accommodate him? No. I said, you're being a jerk. You don't get to do this. Go get a gym membership. So in that case, I'm not going to accommodate the guy, even though it's kind of my job. And I think a lot of people can think of things like this. So this gets us into the integration. And remember, the integration is the first place here where you get to state your opinion, where you get to say, here's what I think about it. And you're not going to put it in the I voice, but the summary and the analysis are completely objective. All you're saying is there's stuff here that you can see, that you can notice, and it doesn't matter if you agree with it or not. It doesn't matter whether you think they're good ideas or not. You have to admit these ideas are here. Both of these are completely objective, and everybody should be able to look at them and say, yes, I understand that. The integration says, once we understand these underlying ideas, we can start to test them. Real quickly, if I was going to use that to expand it, and I was going to say, Tan's essay makes a strong point about Tan's mother and other people whose difficulties with interacting with other people come from speaking a different language. But it applies, and here's where you get into your correlative conjunction, it applies not only to people whose difficulties come from language, but also to people whose difficulties come from, can you think of another example of somebody who might be difficult to understand, but you should still accommodate them? Mental disorders, and some of these, it's absolutely clear that you should tolerate that person a little bit more. Cerebral palsy, for example, is not a mental disorder, it's a physical disorder, but it makes a person sound like they have a mental disorder. It's very hard to understand them, but the thought process is crystal clear. So, in that case, what you're saying is, it's hard for me to understand you, but there's a physical reason for it. Deaf people, hard to interact with in a customer service situation or any kind of public situation. Should you accommodate them? You'd have to be an absolute jerk to say, oh man, you're deaf, get out of here. I don't like deaf people. They're hard to work with. Other things you can think of that would cause something like this? Make a person hard to understand?
I think like really old people, because
absolutely. And we know we do this. With old people, we're going to say, I'm going to put up with this, even though I wouldn't put up with it for anybody else, because it's kind of my job. It's kind of something that we do in our culture. It's our rules. Okay, so that's if you're expanding it. You could say it can be disability, it can be age, whatever it is. You're saying she's right about language, but it's also true for disability, it's also true for age. If you're going to do a clash here, you're going to say, Tan's argument clearly works when applied to examples like her mother. However, this doesn't mean that in every single instance like this, we are obligated to tolerate that particular person or to accommodate that particular person. What's an example where you wouldn't? And we've talked about a few. If the person is drunk, obviously. If the person has chosen to be a certain way. And you know, some of them get kind of silly, but I find sometimes if a person has recently gotten a tongue piercing, it's kind of hard to understand what they're saying. Should I be tolerant of that? It's not like a disability. I don't know. I don't know what to say about that, because some people look at me like they're kind of... So that one's up to you, but there's things that a person can choose to do that can make them difficult to understand, and the question is, where should we be accommodated and where shouldn't we? But in this case, what you need to do is find examples where you can say, here, accommodation is not necessary, and here's why, and give a strong reason for it. Okay, and then how you fill this one out is you say, here's the basic idea of the kind of person I'm talking about who we don't necessarily have to tolerate. Here's one example, here's another example. What these have in common is, and you describe the basic point, and then you bring it back to Tan. End with a reference to Tan, always. Always end your essay, end your integration by bringing it back into the essay, not by going off on your own point. Okay, so get these in by class time tomorrow. I will try to grade as many of the Sedaris ones as I can today, but it's going to be quite a while before your next one is due. So don't worry about it. Just get this one in. And if you didn't get your Sedaris one in on time, you can turn it in late. I will accept those all the way up until class time tomorrow.